In this video, we're going to look at my favorite provisional cast-on method using waste yarn. You can also use an extra cable from a set of interchangeable needles, but it works great with waste yarn too. So you've seen me just tie a slip knot using my working yarn and a long strand of waste yarn, and place that slip knot over the needle and prepare for a cast on. So I've got my working yarn over my index finger and my waste yarn over my thumb, and the slip knot on the needle doesn't count as a stitch. That's just going to hold the yarn in place as we get going, and that will be removed later. So now you'll see me start the provisional cast on, and I'm just going to wrap the yarn the same direction for each stitch that I cast on, making sure it goes the same direction over the needle and alternating between picking up a stitch under the waste yarn and over the waste yarn. So I'll twist my left hand as I do this just to make it easier to get a hold of the working yarn, but you'll notice that the working yarn goes over the needle the same direction every time. And now that we have several stitches casted on, we'll look at what we've got here on our needle. So those nice neat stitches that wrap the same direction, and on the underside you see the waste yarn is running through each stitch to hold it in place and leave live loops that we can later go back and pick up to knit the opposite direction. I'll just keep casting on those stitches until I reach the number that my pattern says that I need before we move on. Okay, we're nearing the end of the stitch count that I need in order to start my project, and when I finish my last cast on stitch, I will twist the yarn around the waste yarn just to make sure that last stitch stays in place, and then I begin the process of straightening these out on the needle. So you want to make sure that you don't twist the waste yarn around the needle when you're stretching these stitches out. So your waste yarn should always be to the inside of the needles, making sure that it's not twisting around the needles as you go around. So this takes a little time. Sometimes it can be a little bit fiddly, and it's probably the hardest part about this cast on, but once you get it done, it's very worth it. Sometimes I like to tie both tails of my waste yarn together with the tail of the working yarn that I started with, and I tie a knot here just so that later if I want to try on my sweater, which is what I'm making in this case, I don't lose any yarn in the process. I don't lose my waste yarn that's holding my stitches, and don't drop any stitches that way. So I'm going to let you watch me fiddle around with this quite a bit here, just so that you know that sometimes it's not always pretty getting these stitches to line up. It can be a little bit tedious, but again, this is worth it in my opinion to make it easier on the other end when you go back and pick up your stitches again. So I've removed that slip knot from the needle because we don't need that anymore, and I'm just making sure that I can push stitches to both tips of the needles so that I can connect the stitches and start working in the round. And remember that you've made sure that your waste yarn is always in the center so that you're not twisting your stitches. Here you see me placing a locking stitch marker on the first stitch. Actually, I think I've grabbed the second there, but usually you would want to mark the first stitch so that I just like to do that so that when I go back, I don't have any question about where I started. But in this case, I've also left that waste yarn there, and the knot in the waste yarn is going to tell you where you started your cast on too. So that's another easy way to tell where your first stitches will be when you go pick up again and start working the other direction. But in the end, after you've knit a few rounds, you should get something that looks somewhat like this. So I've got my stitch marker marking my first stitch there, and you can start to see that stockinette fabric growing in the opposite direction from my cast on. And you can see those live loops that are still on my waste yarn that I'll pick up later when I want to work the other direction. And again, the stitch marker I just put there to mark my first stitch, that's an optional thing. And here we are on a different day with a different sweater. I've picked up my stitches from a provisional cast on waste yarn, and I've put them on the needles, and now I'm just wanted to show you that sometimes this last stitch that should be heading the other direction is incomplete. So I've wrapped that stitch, the yarn, the tail of yarn that was hanging out of that last stitch around the needle and placed it back through the stitch below the needle to complete this stitch. And now I have the correct stitch count to move forward. So I'm going to place my marker to note the beginning of round like my pattern tells me to, and then I'm going to go knit in the opposite direction from where I started. But you'll notice these stitches, when you use this cast on method, are oriented the opposite direction every other stitch. So if I were to knit this first stitch normally, it's going to twist the stitch, and that tells me that I need to knit this first stitch through the back loop. The next stitch was oriented in the typical fashion, so I will just knit that as normal. And then the following stitch again is oriented backwards on my needle, so I need to knit that through the back loop. So just a word of caution that you'll want to watch your stitches in your first round to make sure that you're not twisting them, and it should be every other stitch that changes the direction. So knitting through the back loop every other stitch.